friends, yesterday we took a walk around the room and started looking more into fairy tales, and we saw lots of different books that we were familiar with, some we haven't heard of, some we've read before. Well, today we're going to take a closer look at some of the magical elements in fairy tales, and we're going to look at the book Cinderella. Raise your hand if you've ever heard of Cinderella before. That's what I thought. It's a really popular one, so today we're going to look at it and see what magical elements we find in Cinderella. We remember that some of the characteristics of fairy tales are that fairy tales have imaginary or magical characters, settings, or creatures. Some of them may be magical, some are very fictitious and made up, and today we're going to take a closer look at those things. Let's quickly read through Cinderella so we can have it fresh in our mind. And as I read, I want you guys to be thinking about what types of things make this story magical. Cinderella. Once upon a time, there lived an unhappy young girl. Her mother had died, and her father had married a widow with 2 daughters. Her stepmother doted on her own daughters. Nothing was too good for them. Dresses, shoes, parties, whatever they wanted. But for the poor, unhappy girl, there was nothing at all. Her dresses were her stepsister's hand-me-downs. Her dinner was nothing but scraps. Her day was filled with hard work. Only when evening came was that she allowed to sit for a while by the fire near the cinders. Everybody called her Cinderella. One day a beautiful new dress arrived at the house. A ball was about to be held at the palace, and the stepsisters were invited. Cinderella didn't ask if she could go too. She knew very well what the answer would be. Instead, Cinderella began her chores. She washed the dishes, scrubbed the floors, and made the beds. "I'm so unhappy," she sighed. Suddenly, when Cinderella was all done, a fairy appeared. "Don't be alarmed, Cinderella," said the fairy. "I am your fairy godmother. I know you'd love to go to the ball, so you shall." "But I'm dressed in rags," sighed Cinderella. The fairy godmother smiled and flicked her magic wand. Cinderella found herself wearing the most beautiful dress she had ever seen. Cinderella was speechless. "Now for your coach," said the fairy godmother. "Bring me a pumpkin." Then the fairy godmother turned to the cat. "Bring me 7 mice." Cinderella soon returned with the pumpkin and the cat with 7 mice. With the flick of her magic wand, the fairy godmother turned the pumpkin into a sparkling coach. Next she turned the magic mice into 6 white horses and a coachman. Cinderella could hardly believe her eyes. "There's one condition," said the fairy godmother. "The magic will wear off at the last stroke of midnight, so you must be home by then." "I will, thank you, fairy godmother," said Cinderella, beaming. Cinderella had a wonderful time at the ball, dancing with the prince himself. Then, when she heard the first stroke of midnight, without a word of goodbye, she slipped from the prince's arm and ran down the steps. As she ran, she lost one of her slippers. Still, away she fled, vanishing into the night. The prince was now madly in love with her. He picked up the slipper and said to his ministers, "Search everywhere for the girl whose foot this slipper fits. I will never be happy until I find her." The ministers tried the slipper on the foot of every girl in the land until only Cinderella was left. "That awful untidy girl simply cannot have been at the ball," snapped her stepmother. "The prince ought to marry one of my 2 daughters. Can't you see how ugly Cinderella is?" To everyone's amazement, the shoe fit Cinderella perfectly. The fairy godmother appeared and waved her magic wand. In a flash, Cinderella was transformed. In an elegant dress, Cinderella shone with youth and beauty. Her stepmother and stepsisters gaped at her in amazement. The ministers had found the prince's love. Cinderella and the prince married the very next day and lived happily ever after. The end. So I'm sure you guys were reminded of Cinderella, and this was a kind of a different version maybe than some of you have heard, but it still reminds us of the magical things that happen in this fairy tale. So let's take a closer look. Let's see what kinds of things we noticed. Can anybody tell me something they may have noticed? You're right, her fairy godmother. Now raise your hand if you have a fairy godmother. Yeah, not many of us do because this is one of the magical elements of this fairy tale. The fairy godmother used her magical wand and she gave Cinderella a beautiful new dress for the ball. And she turned a pumpkin into a carriage. That's right. And those little mice, she turned them into what? Yes, 6 white horses. Now that is some serious magic. The magic also, we know, the fairy godmother said the magic was going to end at the stroke of midnight, and that the slipper that Cinderella wore only fit one person. That's kind of magical in itself. Some of the things in this book are not so obvious, like the magic wand and the fairy godmother turning objects into magical things. Some of the things are a little less hard to notice, but in fairy tales, this fairy tale started with once upon a time. And as this fairy tale starts and we hear once upon a time, this leads us to that imaginary place that fairy tales often do. Something else is Prince Charming. Now, we know there are real princes in the world, and we know that in this story, the prince is used to make this story more magical because she falls in love with a prince. And this story tells us that Cinderella goes from this poor little girl to a girl that's unloved to someone who is loved, and she ends up marrying the prince. So it's a story of someone going from rags to riches. Not so obvious, but that is a really thing that happens in fairy tales quite often, is we see someone that is not doing so well and maybe not loved, or some poor little girl or something, and then their life turns around into this magical kind of fairy tale like ending. So now I want you guys to turn and talk, and I want you to think of another fairy tale that you might have read, and you can think of some magical elements with your friends. And we're going to wrap up talking to our partner, and then we'll get back together tomorrow to go over the next aspects of our fairy tale. Thank you guys so much for being great listeners today.